That's big time.
Minus 15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Ed Smith Stadium down in Sarasota, Florida. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff. We have traded the cold weather in Baltimore for the warm weather in Florida. Unlike Heston Kersad's steak at the steakhouse, that's not a fair value trade. We are giving up the cold weather. We are getting the warm weather. This is not a case of you give the steakhouse $100 and they give you a steak and you both feel like you got good value.
That's kind of an if you know, you know statement from Brendan.
We're starting really inside Orioles here.
Really inside the bird's nest. Yeah. Bird's nest looks a little bit different here, but I am happy. I got a little sunburn on Monday, so it's fading a little bit, hopefully turning into a tan, but
the first sunburn of the season is always good, and it's great to get it out of the way in mid-February when you can.
I knew that February counted as spring.
I know, and we've got baseball sounds, which is maybe my first and biggest observation here from spring training is it's nice to just hear loud contact, to hear the ball hitting the mitt. Like, baseball's back. We're so back.
An underrated sound.
Yeah.
Just in everyday life that we were missing for the last how many months?
I know. When you're hearing it in June, you don't properly rate it.
Oh,
when
yeah.
you hear it in February for the first time, you're like,
Yeah.
man, I miss just a ball hitting a glove.
We're just so back.
We're so back. Baseball is here. And on today's podcast, Annie, we're going to talk about some of the observations as we have been here down in Sarasota at Orioles spring training here at Ed Smith Stadium. I think the first one I want to talk about is maybe a move that was underrated a little bit at the time, but has just so much more hype at spring training, and that's Tomy Yuki Sugano.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of that, maybe I'm being swept up into the hype a little bit of the media presence around Sugano. We are here with a lot of members of Japanese media who are here following Sugano, and when you zoom out a little bit and realize who's here, I mean, this is one of the most decorated pitchers in KPB history. I mean, this is one of the best Japanese pitchers to come over to the United States. I know Sugano is later on in his career, and it's not the same kind of pitcher like a Roki Sasaki that is a lot younger,
right.
And maybe you're signing to a longer-term contract. But this is an MVP of the NPB. Like, this is a really, really big deal that Sugano is here, and the media presence following him here. Like, it's just kind of cool to be around.
Yeah, no, it was definitely kind of a culture shock at first because the Orioles beat has pretty much multiplied and exponentially, and
right.
It's so much larger now, and it is really fascinating to see all these new media members, especially ones coming all the way from Japan, also bringing in a lot more questions that are really kind of cool to hear when they ask their questions to a Drew French or Brandon Hyde, and just really brings a whole new perspective, and it is really bizarre, but also really cool yesterday when Sugano was having his first bullpen session, and you just see the masses of the media go from one of the ballparks or the fields to where the bullpen session was. It's like kind of swimming upstream if you're going the opposite direction.
Yeah, Elvis is here at Orioles camp, essentially.
What it feels like.
And it's not just the hype either. I mean, we got a chance to watch that bullpen session, and he was sharp.
Right.
Everything. Gary Sanchez said when we talked to him after the bullpen session that he could have closed his eyes and the ball just would have appeared in his glove. That is how pinpoint accurate Sugano is with his pitches. The splitter had some awesome movement to it. Drew French and Brandon Hyde both noted that. Like, it was a really, really precise bullpen session. I know it's just a bullpen session. He wasn't facing live batters. He hasn't even done live batting practice yet, as Brandon Hyde has said. Like, he had an 18-hour flight. He's got, jet lag. We're trying to get him back into the swing of things, and this is a veteran who knows his body. He knows how to prepare himself for a season. So they're letting him kind of do his thing, do his routine, and work his way back into it. And it was just a bullpen session, but it was a really, really impressive bullpen session.
Yeah, it definitely impressed the media and everyone that was there to see it. And we've talked about in podcasts before where with Sugano and Charlie Morton as well, both very seasoned veterans in their own specific leagues, you know what you're getting when you sign these types of guys. And with Sugano, you were hoping that walk rate and his command would translate to into MLB and just culture here. And so far, with an 18-hour flight not very long ago and coming in, serving his first bullpen session and that kind of elite command that we saw already, it just makes you wonder, imagine what he's going to be like after he's fully acclimated to life here and some actual rest that he hasn't necessarily gotten right now. But that's one of the things that you were looking out for Sugano, was that elite command, how it pairs with Zach Eflin's command, that walk rate in the two of them. So I'm really, really excited to see what it is, and especially after the first bullpen session yesterday, it makes you excited.
Yeah, and we're going to see how he looks against hitters. This is MLB hitters, and you can be as precise as you want to. If the stuff is not great in the zone, it's still going to get hit. So we're going to see how the stuff plays. But just from the bullpen perspective, the stuff had a lot of movement. It was incredibly precise. And if you can hit your spots and execute that well, that's going to play at the big league level. And we'll see how the stuff plays in the zone. I think Sugano is going to live in the zone a lot, just because of how precisely he's able to locate his pitches. It's not going to be middle. You can pretty much guarantee that from him. So we'll see how he does when he starts to face live hitters. As mentioned, Brandon Hyde and company they're easing him into this because, as mentioned, it's jet lag. It's a culture shock. It's a whole bunch of different things that Sugano is adjusting to. But he's kind of been the story thus far from a media perspective of just how much frenzy there has been around him. The guy who was catching him has also had an impressive camp thus far, and that's Gary Sanchez. And I think an underrated aspect of Gary coming in, when it relates to Sugano specifically, is that Gary has had some experience catching Japanese pitchers in Masahiro Tanaka with his time in the Yankees organization and with Yu Darvish in San Diego. So Gary, yes, there is a language barrier there, but it was clear that Gary Sanchez was comfortable in that situation.
Right, and it was definitely wild because when it was the first bullpen session for Sugano, it was Gary Sanchez catching that. So it was kind of our first glimpse of seeing two of the new veterans brought in. And for that first bullpen session, it was really, really cool to watch how Sugano was communicating with Gary from across the way. He would motion to which side of the plate he wanted Gary on, and it was just really cool because I know in our minds part of that storyline that we wanted to look out for in spring training was how is that language barrier going to translate with Sugano and the rest of the clubhouse. But so far so good. I think the only way to communicate is with just good ball, and I think that's what you said with Rock Kubako yesterday, where you really can't, there's not really a barrier when you have great pitches like that. And it really does help when Gary is used to having Japanese pitchers like that. He's used to the way that they set up. He's used to their communication style. So that is definitely an underrated topic of something that this front office, I'm sure, thought of when they were bringing in Gary Sanchez and Sugano together as well. Yeah,
and good pitch is a universal language, as Rock and I were talking about yesterday. And Gary is able to communicate with Sugano. It's just cool to see.
Yeah.
There's a language barrier, but there's a baseball language that all of those guys can communicate with. And that was just something neat. And Gary has had a good camp as well, hit a couple of home runs. So excited to see him. I don't know if Gary is among the top two of catchers that have been talked about here at spring training. We'll start with Adley Rutman because Adley has come in. He looks like he's in great shape, had a big offseason. I mean, the dude looks jacked right now. It was clearly a focus in the offseason to, get in great shape coming into the year. Said he did a lot of work, both offensively and defensively. Brandon Hyde said he came in really inspired, really hungry. So good to see Adley Rutman, who has been consistently one of the better players on this team, come in and have that fire under him.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if there's even too much more to add to that because the whole story is just that Adley, to some, would have had a low season at points last year.
Yeah, the second half of last season, he'd be the first to admit those numbers weren't what they wanted.
He would 100% admit that, and Hyde as well. And that's when you hear Hyde say that he has been inspired by kind of shifting the narrative from last season to this season, especially when the whole squad had low points in the season, offensive slumps. Adley was one of those guys who is definitely looking to make a name for himself and shift the narrative from last season, and you can tell that he's already doing that. I mean, 2 homers in live BP the other day, has been hitting really well, both offensively and defensively. Brandon Hyde's told us that there are definitely some moves that he's been making in the offseason and working on both sides of his playing.
Yeah, and speaking of beefed up, can we talk about Jackson Holiday? Apparently the dude just ate an insane amount of ground beef in the offseason because, my goodness, Jackson Holiday
If you're looking
looks
to bulk,
large.
listen to ground beef.
I don't know what the diet was. I need to ask Jackson Holiday specifically, like, can you give me the macros? Can you give me all that information? Because that dude looks big. He's not Matt Holiday big, but
Right.
Jackson Holiday, whoo,
Noticeable
man,
difference from last
yeah,
year.
that's a big dude.
Yeah, and I think that comes with how we were talking about the added maturity that Morton and Sugano and Sanchez and Tyler O'Neill, even we haven't spoke about him too much yet, but
likes to wear tight shirts, as Brandon Hyde said today.
Yes, exactly. Talk about a yoked guy. That
Whoa,
is
yeah.
Tyler O'Neill.
Tyler O'Neill, his dad was a bodybuilder, and Tyler O'Neill looks like he could have been a bodybuilder if he was not
sure
playing
does.
outfield for the
He
Orioles.
sure does. But that added maturity that this clubhouse has just received, I mean, Ryan O'Hearn, one of the leaders in this clubhouse, and a veteran for that matter, has said that the collective maturity and experience in the clubhouse this year is a lot greater than last year. And the same goes with these young guys where they've had 2 playoff experiences that did not end well. So that experience is experience. It's a bad experience is what he said, but you have that extra playoff experience under your belt. So the maturity, not only from the young guys, but also the new veterans that have been added into the clubhouse, it looks like a very much different ball club in terms of maturity. And then, of course, with Jackson Holiday and Enrique Bradfield Jr. adding some weight and definitely maturing on the field.
Yeah, and maturing looks different for Jackson Holiday and Enrique Bradfield Jr., who you mentioned as well, came into camp looking a lot heavier than he did last year in a good way. Bradfield also said that he feels faster than he did last season.
Which I don't know how that's possible.
Absolutely ridiculous considering he's one of the fastest players in minor league baseball already. But maturity looks different. For Jackson Holiday and Enrique Bradfield Jr., it was adding weight. And for a lot of guys like Adley Rutman and Gunnar Henderson and Jordan Westberg, you are coming in with another year under your belt. And that is really valuable for a team that has lost some veteran leaders like Anthony Santander, James McCann, John Means just recently signed with the Guardians. So there are voids there in terms of the clubhouse leadership. And there are guys that are the natural ones to come in and fill those gaps. Charlie Morton is, in his age 41 season at this point, so he is an obvious veteran leader to look towards. Cedric Mullins as well, who is, kind of the veteran on this Orioles team at this point in terms of his tenure in Baltimore. But then it's really, Jordan Westberg and Adley Rutman and Gunnar Henderson. Like, this is turning into their team, and I think we're seeing it in the clubhouse. Jordan Westberg especially has stood out to me as somebody who just feels like a leader in the clubhouse, and I think we're going to see that from him this season. An interesting note from Brandon Hyde as well that is worth noting as we talk about Jordan Westberg and Jackson Holiday. Jordan Westberg, it wasn't a 50-50 split. It was still a little bit more time at third base than second base last season, but Brandon Hyde noted yesterday that Jordan Westberg is going to get significantly more time, it would seem, at third base than he is at second base. He said maybe some reps at second, but it's mostly going to be a third base spot. And we saw this after Gunnar Henderson's spectacular season where it was, hey, we don't need you bouncing between shortstop and third base. Like, shortstop is your position. You have earned that right. And I think Jordan Westberg is in that conversation as well. After an all-star campaign last year, seems like he has earned the right to have pretty much one position for the season. I think he'll probably still play at second base occasionally, but it seems like third base is where Jordan Westberg is going to call home most of the season.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree that he has earned those stripes to kind of say from the head coach, like, hey, we know what you're capable of, and we know that you should stick to this one position. And I think that he 100% is a leader in this clubhouse, and I think we're going to see, we hope to at least see from more leadership from the young core in Gunnar and Jordan and Adley and Colton even, but all in very different ways. I mean, Jordan is very much an unsung hero of the group, definitely not going to be that vocal guy, and he even told you that the other day in an interview. But to have that variation from these guys and their personalities as well as their depth and talent from what they bring to the table, it really is going to be key for both of them to step up into those leadership roles in different ways.
Yeah, and the versatility is good from Westberg. I mean, it's nice that he is able to play third base and second base. He could probably play shortstop if you wanted him to, too. He was a shortstop coming up through the Orioles minor league system. But what it does mean is if Jordan Westberg is playing mostly third base, second base is open, and that spot more than likely will go to Jackson Holliday on most days. I know Ramon Arias is in the mix as well, and I think we could see some scenarios where, maybe Jordan Westburg does play some second base with Ramon Arias at third if Jackson Holliday is getting a day off against a left-handed hitter. But if Jordan Westburg is going to be at third base more often than not, Ramon Arias is more of a third baseman than he is a second baseman. I think he's still solid at second base, but he won a Gold Glove at the hot corner. So I would imagine you would like to have Arias at third if he is filling in there. So second base is really Jackson Holliday's spot to lose at this point if you don't have much Jordan Westburg at that position.
Yeah, and versatility has come through in a few other players that we've seen too, in Kobe Mayo, Samuel Basayo, both trying to prove themselves in their defensive versatility, both of which have been mashing in BPs over the last few days. Really excited. Basayo has definitely been a hot topic of conversation, which is very interesting because there's no shot that he breaks camp, but he has been quite the topic of conversation over the last few days and week.
Yeah, Samuel Basayo has looked really, really good at spring training. And I think we knew coming in that Basayo's bat is always going to jump off the page. It is incredible exit velocities. He can hit the ball over the mountain. The dude can just flat out mash. But the impressive thing thus far at spring training has been his defense. Right. He was talking to us and said that, that was really his focus in the offseason was his all-around defense, whether that was receiving, calling a game, blocking, sliding, all of those different things. And we have heard from, Charlie Morton was joking the other day where he threw a batting practice session to Samuel Basayo, and Charlie Morton's new to the organization, and of course he knows a lot of the big league guys and things like that, but doesn't know somebody like Samuel Basayo. And I guess he kind of went up to people and was like, who was that that was catching me? He's really, really good. And of course it was Samuel Basayo. So that's a really encouraging sign if you're an Orioles fan, because Samuel Basayo, we know the bat is going to translate. If he came up to the big leagues and played first base and DH, still a really good player. But if he can be a solid defensive catcher as well, that is a whole other dimension of good player.
Right, and talk about maturity. I mean, this guy is 20 years old, and most people around the block here, especially Brandon Hyde, have just been so impressed with how mature this guy is for his age. He's huge for 20 years old, for one, but also just extremely mature, making really big strides to kind of push the boundary for his interviews and speak them fully in English. At least he's hoping to.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Really impressive because we met with him in Bowie last year, where it was a lot more Spanish speaking and translation into it, but this year he really was like, okay, I'm going to try and answer or listen to these fully in English and answer them on his own. And he was I want to say 75% there.
Yeah, and obviously, from our perspective, doesn't make a difference to us if we're talking to a translator and Basayo's going through there, but it does make a difference in the clubhouse if you are able to communicate with everybody, kind of thing. And it was cool from Samuel Basayo just to hear that. It's impressive that he is
super
learning a language.
impressive.
That's just really cool on its own. So Basayo, I think, maybe the talk of camp outside of Tomy Yuki Sugano, he's been super, super impressive. I think in general, Annie, the takeaway for me, talking to guys in the clubhouse and seeing how everybody is interacting here on the fields at Ed Smith Stadium, there's so much depth. And, we've had the outfield conversation of how is that going to play out with, signing Laureano to a major league contract and Heston Kjerstad. Mike Elias has said that he has earned big league at-bats. I think we can talk about those conversations all we want to. We're probably going to talk about it ad nauseum as we get closer to the season. But there is so much depth on this team. We just heard from Zach Britton earlier, and Zach was asked, maybe some comparisons between his really good Orioles teams and this Orioles team. He's like, man, there's a lot more depth here. Just watching bullpens and seeing some of the arms, maybe even some of the arms that aren't going to break camp with the team. There's just a lot of good players out here. And even the non-roster invitees, there are guys that turn your head. Every time you walk by a bullpen session, Heflin and, Ramirez, there are just pitchers where you're like, oh my God, that's a live fastball. And it just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah, and it feels a lot bigger of a deal once you see them in person, because
Yeah.
seeing the group that the front office has brought in and formulated right now, where you have Eflin from last year that you acquired at the trade deadline, Grayson Rodriguez, who was injured last season, is coming back and throwing BPs, and then you bring in Mortensen, Sugano, and then that fifth spot maybe, or Dean Kramer, of course, and then also the guys in Cade Povich, Albert Suarez, Trevor Rogers we haven't really seen because of some injury, but it just really does seem like a really deep crew, and I know that one of our key needs for this Orioles team in this offseason was to provide pitching staff depth.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they've done, because you do not want to make the same mistake twice and go down with injury for all these pitching staff members, and then you're like, okay, now what do we do? They have kind of built a boundary or barrier for them to be able to heed that this coming season. And also Kyle Bradish, who could be coming in the second half. So I do feel really confident about this pitching staff after seeing them live in person.
Yeah, and that was where the Orioles struggled last year. Of course, there were, other on-the-field factors, but this team was really injured down the stretch, and Mike Elias obviously made it a priority to make sure that there was an abundant amount of depth that the Orioles could turn to at any point. There are really good players. I mean, we haven't even talked about Kobe Mayo and his batting practice sessions where he is clearing the left field stands consistently. Like, that dude can absolutely mash. And I think
so excited for him to make it.
And I think on most other teams around baseball, you are finding a spot for Kobe Mayo somewhere, but this is an Orioles team that is competing for an AL East crown. They are making a playoff push. Hopefully, they're hoping that it's a deep playoff push. And there's just so much depth on this team that Kobe Mayo doesn't have a natural spot to break camp. But, man, that dude can mash. And you see 15, 16 position players that realistically could make an impact on this big league team, and you would feel good about them making an impact on this big league team. I think the same thing can be said for the starting pitchers, where there are 5 starters that feel solidified, and maybe there's not as much of a battle there, but man, if you start going to number 6, Albert Suarez, number 7, Cade Povich, number 8, Trevor Rogers once he's back from injury, number 9, Chase McDermott when he's back from injury, and then Bradish and Tyler Wells as well, that's 10, 11 guys that I would say, man, I feel pretty solid if they are taking the mound at some point during the season. There is just so much quality depth here. And I think the guys really bought into that. Ryan O'Hearn noted just how many players showed up early to spring training. I mean, we got here yesterday. That was supposed to be the first full squad workout because everybody was reporting on Monday, and everybody was already here by the time that we got here, because it seemed like there were so many players that reported early. So there's a lot of buy-in, and there's a lot of depth, and there's a lot of good competition here thus far.
Yeah, and not to mention the depth in the bullpen, too, because
depth everywhere.
Also really cool to see Felix Bautista back and throwing. I mean, it's definitely a lighter load as they're ramping him up to get back to 100%. He said at the beginning of camp that he was about 80% and hoping and felt really, really confident that he'd be at 100% by opening day. Yeah,
and obviously if you have a healthy Felix Bautista, the bullpen looks a heck of a lot different going into the season than it does where you have a lot of guys like Sir Anthony Dominguez and Gregory Soto that could close games for you, but Felix Bautista is just
you want as your closer,
an absolute game changer. And there's depth all around. And I know that there were larger contracts that some fans were hoping to hand out, whether it be to a Corbin Burns or an Anthony Santander or otherwise. David Rubenstein was quick to point out that the Orioles payroll has increased percentage-wise more than any other team in baseball, and they have used it on depth. And I think in past seasons, we would be talking a lot more about somebody like Dylan Carlson, who, could have been making this team a few seasons ago, but now you're looking at Heston Kjerstad and Ramon Laureano as a number 4, number 5 outfielder. It's really good depth to have, and it gives Brandon Hyde a ton of options where, hey, Tyler O'Neill has struggled with injuries over his career. You want to keep him fresh. You want to keep him healthy. Okay, for facing a right-handed pitcher, Tyler O'Neill has pretty dramatic splits, so let's put in Heston Kjerstad, who, can hopefully mash some right-handed pitching. Cedric Mullins, need him to have an off day? Sure, Laureano.
Yeah.
You can put him in a quarter outfield, move Colton Cowser to center field. There are going to be so many options for Brandon Hyde coming into this season because the depth is just everywhere. I mean, I started this conversation talking about the position player depth, and then we went into starting pitching, and then we went into the bullpen. So that's all of it. That is all of the depth. So it's really impressive to see all of these guys here, and it's a well of talent.
Yeah, it 100% is a well of talent, and I think my first spring training experience, really, really cool to see. Ooh. There's so much going on as well. I don't know if many people even know the layout, but I was like, wow, okay, there's about 4 or 5 fields here. There's you got some minor league prospects on this field, the top prospects. Okay, you're watching Enrique Bradfield Jr., who could easily slot into a major league center field or outfield.
Defensively, he is certainly there, yeah.
Offensively, still some work to do, and he knows that, but and then you go and look at another field. I almost got hit in the head today by Kobe Mayo. But
head on a swivel here
head
at
on a
Smith
swivel.
Stadium.
I mean, head through the camera lens, and you could be knocked out. So glad I'm here and glad the camera's still alive, too.
The camera still being alive was solid for this podcast, certainly.
Very solid.
But there's a lot of talent here, and it's been a lot of fun to see. Annie, we won't be here as games start up, but what are some maybe, 2 or 3 keys that you're looking at to say, okay, what are key storylines that I am looking at going into these spring training games?
Spring training games, I definitely want to continue to see how Sugano works with not only Gary Sanchez, like we saw in one live bullpen session, but also with Adley Rutman, because Hyde noted that it's not going to be just Sanchez, given his experience with Japanese pitchers, catching for Sugano, but I definitely want to see how he interacts with Adley as well. So that's one of them. Did you say 3 or 2?
I said 2 or 3. I'll give you one. And I think one of them is going to be how Heston Kjerstad performs with a little bit less pressure.
Yeah.
I know that Heston Kjerstad is still going to play like he has to make this team. There is still competition there, and I'm not saying that Heston Kjerstad is 100% on this big league roster, but Mike Elias has said that he has earned big league at-bats, and Heston Kjerstad is going into his age 26 season. This is still a prospect, but this is an older prospect at this point that we are excited to see at the big league level. So I'm excited to see what Kjerstad can do in spring training. There is a little bit of an outfield competition there. I think there's certainly competition if you're looking at maybe the 12th and 13th spots in this position player battle. I think Kjerstad is the leader in the clubhouse to get one of those spots.
Yeah.
But I still want to see how he performs and what he's able to do defensively. We know the bat is going to be there, but I know he doesn't necessarily need a huge spring, as Mike Elias said. It'd still be nice to have a good spring.
Right. I guess my next one, similarly to that outfield battle a little bit, but I am excited to see what all the right-handed hitters that this front office has brought in this offseason, how they perform in platoon situations where if you bring in Gary Sanchez, we've talked a lot about him on the defensive side of things, but he also hit a homer in live BP yesterday. I'm really excited to see how he performs from the right side of the plate. Tyler O'Neill, Ramon Laureano, just a lot more depth that's been brought in on the right side of the plate so that you don't always have to press like we saw a lot last season where you have O'Hearn going in against left on left or Mountie going in right on right. So a lot of more depth in that situation. So I'm excited to see and interested to see how those new free agents come in and perform in those situations.
All right, you gave 2, I'll give 2. I think my final key that I'll be looking at is just guys that are back. And I think those 2 guys are going to be Adley Rutman and Jackson Holliday.
Okay.
Adley Rutman struggled at the second half of last year. The dude looks so beyond locked in spring training thus far that it's not even funny. Talked about Jackson Holliday just getting beefed up with ground beef diet in the offseason. I think coming into year 2, not as much pressure as last year being the number 1 prospect in baseball, having the insane media circus around him. It was still a whirlwind for Jackson Holliday to get up to the big leagues last year. I know he started the year in AAA Norfolk, but the year before that it was 4 different levels of the minors in one season. So he didn't even have a ton of experience at AAA Norfolk. We were talking about him in spring training last year as, is he going to make the team? Is he not going to make the team? Jackson Holliday is going to make this team this year, and he is going to have an opportunity to take that second base position and really make it his, because as the number 1 prospect in baseball, you're expected to be an everyday player at some point relatively quickly. So I think that's going to be Jackson Holliday, and I think we're going to see it in spring training, and I think he's going to have a bigger season than we saw from him last year.
Right, and both of those guys, Adley and Holliday, I think that even though they are everyday players and kind of the faces of this clubhouse right now, they still have a lot to prove, especially after last season falling short in the playoffs. I mean, Holliday did have kind of a tough time to come up and make a big name for himself, but definitely still have a lot to prove after last season. So very excited. I do have confidence, like you do, in those guys just being back.
Yeah.
For sure.
And we are back.
We are back.
Spring training games are just around the corner. The Bird's Nest and our MASN Orioles social pages are going to have you covered throughout Orioles spring training as we lead up to the season. But I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of the Bird's Nest. Make sure you tune in live. I always say every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on our YouTube and Facebook pages. It changes more often than I would like. So we're really going to try to be at 11 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook. And if not, maybe we'll tweet about it. And we'll tell you that we're at a different time, just like we did today for this podcast, which is hopefully going to be at 4 o'clock, and we can get it edited and good to go. But usually say big thank you to our producer, Amy Jennings, behind the scenes. But Amy is stuck in cold Baltimore, and the producers are just us. So big thank you to us in front of the scenes for producing this one. We're going to have plenty more spring training coverage for you, so make sure you are locked into all of our MASN Orioles social pages as we get ready for the season. But for Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.